why don't we just start off with early life, born, parents, siblings, kind of like getting a bit of background from where you were born, and what your family life was looking like as you were growing up.
Wow, okay. So I was born in Palo Alto, California.
Okay.
And my sister, who's almost 3 years older, had already arrived. When I was born,
It's funny how that works, right?
Yeah, right. We got a German Shepherd when I was born named Michelangelo II. We called him lovingly Mickey, and he accompanied me through my childhood. My father was an engineer and a mathematician, and he got work on the East Coast, where he and my mother were from. And my mother was a very young attorney. She had gotten a Yale law degree at a very young age. Was one of 6 women in the class. But when my sister and I were born, she was not working. Then when we moved east, my brother was born, and she eventually started back to work. So my childhood was at that time, so this is the late 60s, early 70s. Both of my parents were working, and that was unusual at that time. So as kids, no one was allowed to play at our house because they thought we were unsupervised. And I think my brother and I got very close at that time. We were always making up games.
What was the year difference between you and your brother?
Oh, sorry, 3 years.
Okay, so it's 3, 3, and 3.
So it's 3, 3, 3, and I'm in the middle.
Yeah.
And I definitely have middle child syndrome,
Which
like
is
stereotypical.
What is middle child syndrome?
Pay attention to me, you know. But and I think that's carried through all the way. I think the eldest obviously gets lots of attention, and so does the youngest. And plus, we had 2 girls and a boy, so he even got more attention. So, and I'm a Pisces, so that intensifies everything. And I think I still carry the middle child syndrome with me a little bit, but of course, I've learned how to navigate it.
So your dad's an engineer, so he's very kind of methodical thinking, and mum's a lawyer, so not really a big artistic influence as a child growing up.
Not at all, but I started writing poetry very young. I think I remember we really wanted to get a boat because we lived near the Chesapeake. We were in Maryland. And every weekend, my dad would take us to these boat shows. By the way, we never got a boat, but it was always, this close. And I started writing poems about these boats. And I remember I wrote this very long poem about this one boat I had fallen in love with called Brown Eyes. And because I have brown eyes, I guess as a child, I was like, oh, that's my boat. And I remember my dad took it and showed his secretary and printed it out. Did he print it out? Did they have computers and typed it out, I guess. And I think everyone thought I was going to be a poet, but I actually didn't get to that.
What age?
I was young. I was probably 6, 7, 8, something.
Oh, yes,
like
so very young, yeah.
Yeah, quite young. But I actually dropped it and didn't circle back to it till after college, actually.
What year was it that you went to New York?
93, the end of 93, the fall of 93.
And you never left?
I never left.
So you're in New York, now you're doing poetry.
I'm in New York, I'm studying, I'm the Master's of Fine Arts in Poetry at Columbia. I'm intimidated by all my peers because they all were rich Ivy Leaguers, Ivy League students, and they knew so much. And I had just stumbled on it. So I felt intimidated, but I think my poetry was pretty imaginative, and I was getting a lot of great feedback. So it kind of went from there.
Yeah, it's unusual, isn't it, poetry?
My father really didn't want me to do it.
No,
I got into a lot of student debt, a lot. I still am. I will take it to the grave. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
But it brought me to the New York, and I think that people say, like, why would you spend all that money to study poetry? Well, first of all, I make my living as a freelance advertising copywriter, and I believe I got that first job because I didn't study advertising. A lot of kids do because they saw the degree from poetry and they gave me a chance. So there's that. And then the other thing is that it brought me to New York. And in New York, it's so diverse. I met so many different people from so many different cultures. And I think if I had stayed in California, I don't know that what the exchanges would have been, you know, in terms of my development.
Yeah, especially in the outdoor world as opposed to the poetry. That's quite a change, isn't it?
Well, I always say California is wonderful for the body and New York is wonderful for the mind. And in the end, I think if you keep your mind stimulated, you can find the nature, you know.
Did you continue in outdoor pursuits in New York, or did you go purely academic at that point?
I wouldn't say I was ever academic, but
you're studying, right?
I mean, I was young and in New York and in a poetry program. I think I had my bicycle with me, and I met a woman who had a car, and we took the bikes out and we would go on long rides upstate, and that was wonderful. The bike eventually got stolen, and there were many years when I didn't have a bike, and I was a runner though. So all my outdoor passion was channeled into just running in the park near Columbia, in Morningside Park.
So bicycling's been, obviously we're here at the Exposure with your exhibition, Shot from a Bicycle. But it's been a theme through your life since early years.
That is true, and I hadn't thought of that either. Yeah.
So when did the camera arrive?
It's kind of interesting story, I think. I got very interested in Buddhism, and that brought me, and because I was working as a freelancer, I was able to actually travel. And
so you'd work for a period of time and then you were able to take your time off?
And I didn't realize that would be the template for the rest of my life. So but at the time I didn't know. I just planned this big trip to India with a Tibetan Rinpoche. It was a pilgrimage. That was also what got me into traveling. I discovered another form of Buddhism, which is Theravadan Buddhism, which is classical Buddhism as it was taught, and it's preserved in Southeast Asia. So Myanmar, where I eventually went to, Thailand, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, those are the places where you have Theravadan Buddhism. So I eventually went to Myanmar to practice in a monastery there.
And this was the moment where you didn't feel that, right?
And this was a moment I didn't feel the rapture. I just felt insecure and like something was going on, and I didn't know what it was. I felt negative energy, you know? And so I started poking around Myanmar. I had outstayed my meditation visa, but I decided I would just stay another month. You could pay money per day if you overstayed. And I came across some very young girls working in the Southeast Asian heat, digging up the road. And they were like maybe 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yeah.
And I just was like, oh my, I'd never seen anything like this before. And it really stayed with me. And I wanted to know all I could about Burma. And so I went back to New York. I started researching. I decided to interview a monk who had fled to Malaysia. And then that's when the saffron protests happened.
What year was that?
That was 2007. Sorry.
And what year was the first, that meditation in Myanmar? The 30
2004.
days? Okay, so this is a 3-year time period now. And you're back at obviously doing your advertising gig to keep the lights on.
And educating myself about Myanmar.
Yeah. So how was your experience being in these spiritual or cultural environments and then jetting back to the busy city?
It was difficult.
A mad advertising world.
It was very difficult.
Did you feel a disconnect to the people around you?
Absolutely. And
do you think that drove you more into what you were doing, to get back faster or to do more while you were there?
Probably. Probably. I remember being in Kuala Lumpur to interview this monk after I had started going back to Burma, and I was interviewing refugees all day, audio interviews, still no camera, just audio stories.
What were you doing with those stories?
So I stumbled onto the story that these refugees from Myanmar who were in Kuala Lumpur, and they had their UNHCR card, which means they had protection under the Geneva Convention that protects the rights of refugees. Malaysia doesn't recognize that. They're not signatory. So they were disappearing. And it turns out that they were being arrested, detained, and
then trafficked.
Deported, but really trafficked for a ransom that they could raise themselves and be released. But they didn't have that kind of money, so they were having to buy their freedom. They were being trafficked.
Where would they be trafficked to?
They were brought to the Thai border from Malaysia, where armed gunmen were waiting for them and gave them a certain number of hours to raise this ransom, which they couldn't raise.
Yeah.
And then they would be, I mostly worked with young men. They would be sold to the fishing boats that fish off the coast of Malaysia and Indonesia, where most of our seafood comes from, most of our shellfish.
I sat next to a guy on the plane coming out here. He was an Indian gentleman, Harry, or Susa, I think it was, and he had been trafficked, him and his family, for 10 years inside the States. And now he's started a foundation. I think he's been on Oprah and met Obama. And
oh, wow.
It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The conversation I had on the plane on the way over here.
Well, there's a lot of it, unfortunately, and not only in Southeast Asia, it's all over the world.
It was quite shocking that he's actually been trafficked inside America.
That's right.
Now he's an advocate for human trafficking. So this is quite a lot going on. I mean, are you writing poetry during this time period, or are you just very much sort of getting involved with this?
I'm really involved with this group of refugees.
Yeah. This is what really grabbed you, isn't it?
Trying to document their experience. Yes. So I wasn't a journalist and I wasn't a photographer, but I stumbled onto this story about human trafficking, and I just jumped in with all I had. And I had a camera, I had like my own point and shoot, so I was taking just, random pictures for myself, I didn't.
But you must have begun to get that realization that this image can do something, right? I mean, or not?
To be honest, they could not be identified. It was really dangerous what they were talking about, not only for them in Malaysia, because they're accusing the officials and they're at risk for this. A lot of them already had this experience that I just described and had been released back into Kuala Lumpur. Some of them had not, but it was very dangerous for them, but it was also dangerous for them, for their families back in Myanmar. They were very worried. They were more worried for their families than for themselves.
If they were identified.
If they were identified, yes. So the fact that I was doing audio recording seemed like the right thing for me to do. And it wasn't until I got back to the United States, wanted to publish this story, that I met a producer from PBS and he said, but we really need imagery. And I had a little bit, but not that much. So we contacted an NGO in Malaysia. They gave us some footage and we used that. We paired it with my narrative.
So this was the first time you understood using the narrative, the audio, and the imagery. So it's all beginning to.
That was.
It's all beginning to take shape.
That was the moment. Yes, I like to say that 2 days after that story aired, 5 state officials were arrested and charged on human trafficking, and I learned that important lesson that to be a powerful storyteller, you really ought to be a photographer, or at least know how to use a good camera. And that was my start.
What did you do during the pandemic?
I was lit. I was really lit. I mean, I grabbed my camera. I was still working for the advertising agency. It was very demanding. We were working even more hours because we were at home. And I remember I always had to wait for client feedback. So I would have maybe 3 hours in the evening while we were waiting for the client feedback to come in, and I would jump on my bike. Nobody was going out, people were afraid, but I just had to. You know, probably because I was working and I wasn't able to be creative.
There was no restriction for you to be...
Yeah, we were told to stay in, but it wasn't like Europe. We didn't have to show a permit or anything like that. But people were scared, so people just weren't out. The streets were completely empty. And I grabbed my camera, and I live in Brooklyn, and I was drawn to ride through a part of Brooklyn that I don't normally ride through to get to the Verrazano Bridge, where there's a beautiful bike, path along the water there. And it was, this is gonna sound strange because it was a pandemic, but it was magical for me. I felt there was this shimmering, I don't know if it was our collective fragility, but there was something so magnificent going on. And I was trying to photograph all of it. And I made some pictures that I'm quite happy with in that time period.
Have you done an exhibition of your New York pandemic imagery, or is that something?
I showed it through one of Frank's projections. And then, I did have some group shows, one at the ICP, International Center of Photography, had a very large show, and then I was in a smaller show at the Museum for the City of New York. And that was a big deal to be in that museum. And they took 2 of my pieces.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, so that was wonderful. And then the murder of George Floyd happened. So at that point, everything changed for me.
And when you say everything changed for you, what, just in...
The need to protest was so compelling. And I think at that point, my freelance job was also winding up, so I had more time.
Yeah.
Because it took a lot of time processing all those images that I would have every day from the protests.
Yeah.
And I really dove into that.
But the unique part about the way that you joined the process was with the bicycle.
Right.
Correct? Yeah. So now you're putting your cycling and your camera together for your activism.
That's right.
And how long did you spend, because that's the body of work that you're exhibiting here at Exposure.
That's right.
So what was the time period that you were involved with the project in terms of shooting your images and writing?
I entered probably around, so they had a weekly ride called the Justice Ride. And I was doing a lot of street protests, so I didn't join the bicycle protests until maybe their 4th one, 4th or 5th, and they did it throughout the fall. So I joined in the summer, I guess in June at some point I joined, and then I did it through October, and I kind of stopped around October. I started back to work, and then I had my project that came out of that, so I was putting all my attention on that project. So I was doing it, I guess it was about 12 weeks I did it in a row.
And how many days a week do you think would you shoot pictures? Just the 1 day a week on the bicycle, or were you doing?
It was every Saturday. I mean, I would also go out in between, but those rides specifically were every Saturday, and they were...
So the protesting went on quite a long time in New York.
Oh yeah, months. I mean, more than months.
Yeah. It was quite interesting.
Numbers, the big, large numbers of protesters, both the bicycle protests and the street protesters, that probably lasted, I mean, the really big numbers, that lasted throughout the summer, and then in the fall it dwindled down. But those people were still out protesting, I mean, even till today.
Because in the city I'm from, instant protests, big information, and then
it was sustained.
Quickly ended.
Yeah, it was remarkable. It was sustained, at least in New York and the major cities, I think, in the U.S. Because it was a community. I got to know a lot of protest photographers that I became friends with. It was a whole different community for me. And most of them were very activist-minded. So a new group of people for me. and we pushed each other on. It was wonderful. It was really wonderful. But then I pivoted because I think as a protester, what made my perspective interesting was I was shooting the movement on the bicycle from the inside out. So I was on a moving bike.
Yeah.
I was catching images of New York that you don't normally see, not just because of the protests, but because our goal was to disrupt. We were shutting down the bridges and the highways. Because of our sheer numbers, we could do that. So we were really bottling up traffic.
Yeah. And I guess with the ability for the bike to move quite quickly,
That's right.
You're covering a lot of ground. So your photographs are being shot in a lot of different areas as well.
A lot of different, all the boroughs. And because we're on the bridges and the highways, we have these iconic views of the bridges, of the skyline, which you would never have.
I heard you talking to Sheikh yesterday about the bicycle with the view across the bridge and how
exactly.
It's a shot you would never get.
It's a shot you would never get, but at the same time, because I was in motion myself, it was the most challenging photography I've ever done, and probably the most challenging I will ever do.
Right, trying to ride the bicycle with a big pack of people, speed, taking images.
And I had two cameras, and I was shooting manual, and I'm not that technically adept still. And it was just like, why I wasn't on automatic, I really don't know. But I wasn't.
Wow.
It was tremendous. It was all consuming. And then I would spend days editing the images.
Is that right? Yeah. In between sort of the rise. Did you form any bonds and friendships with people during that group?
Absolutely.
So you're still connected?
Absolutely.
And where is the movement in the current?
Well, it's interesting. It kept up for about a year in smaller numbers, then it really kind of died out. I think people were very burnt out until just a couple of weeks ago. We had a very big protest because of the brutal murder, the beating to death of Tyree Nichols, which happened in Memphis just 2 weeks ago.
So it's sort of the movement.
I joined that protest, and what was interesting for me, because I had already have this project with children. At the end of the protest, there was some children in Times Square that approached me and wanted me to take their picture, and they were a little bit older. They were like, I would say, I think the youngest was 12 or 13, and there was a 15-year-old there. And I interviewed them, and I said, listen, what do you think of these protests? And the girl who was sort of the ringleader said, you know, it's great, but it's not going to change anything. And I said, why? And she said, because you have to be really, really committed, and you have to keep doing it, and people don't care. People don't. Oh, and I should say these were kids that we were protesting for. These were children of color. And she was saying that the people, they just don't care, and the police beatings are just going to keep happening. This is a 15-year-old, you know?
This is their reality
that
they're facing every day.
Absolutely, and I have a video of that.
Did you have any concept during the time that you were photographing these images, being with these people, that you would eventually be representing them here at exposure for the world to see? Or was that just a dream when that came true? Or?
That was a dream when that came through, absolutely. This has just been a tremendous opportunity. I'm still taking it in every moment. There's another wonderful, amazing thing happening that feels like a dream. But to have the work out there, and also, as you said, when His Highness came and looked at the images and said to me, well, we've seen images, but not like this. Like, these are different. You know, I think it's the intimacy that I was right there. And the stories that I could tell about what was happening. You know, in this picture, this was happening, and this was happening. And
I mean, it's very clear that you had a very intimate relationship with the people you were riding with, traveling with, and being with. I really enjoyed that yesterday, and I think I really enjoyed Sheikh's attention to each story in each picture. It's not like he just came and gave a quick walk around. I mean, he really was very...
He spent a lot of time, and I really got to explain to him what was going on, and he was very interested, and that moved me. And I think he also really moved me because there's a lot of wonderful, amazing protest photography out there, and of the New York protests, of all the major cities in the US, and just really extraordinary work, like mind-boggling. And so I was surprised to represent that here, but it was his words that made me realize why. It's because maybe I don't have the most sensational image, you know, the most dramatic, but there's an intimacy there, and you really get to feel like you're there taking it in, you know? It's and there's a pacing to it, I think, you know?
But it's interesting because it's a fascinating journey through all of the poetry and the activism and the travel and the movement and the different ways that gets to that moment to now be here.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's what great for me is I get to, like, I can see it and hear it, but it's really nice to see how all this roads led to this exhibition. And of course, you've got a new and exciting project that you're already involved in, so I'm sure you want to.
Absolutely.
Let's hear a little bit about this.
The Superpower of Me project. Yeah, no.
And how did that kick off? I suppose it's a good way to start, right?
Yeah. So it came out of the involvement with the protest on the bicycle, and we had the opportunity, as we said, we were riding through all the boroughs. So I was seeing neighborhoods that I wouldn't normally ride through, and I became more and more focused on the children, for who the protests will really matter. And some of them were, you know, so ecstatic they were going to jump out of their skin. But others were bewildered or had blank stares. And as I mentioned the other day, that one image of the children, 3 children looking out at us, this whole line of cyclists.
Yeah.
And predominantly white cyclists, I should say, even though our founders were black. These 3 black children in a predominantly black neighborhood looking out at us from inside of a fast food restaurant, they were, with their phones, and one boy had some sort of tablet and he was recording, but they didn't have smiles, you know? And in the window you can see there's a McDonald's behind us, so that's actually just right under the boys' eyes. And I thought, wow, you know, we're passing through a neighborhood where all these kids, their families, what they can eat is fast food restaurants, you know, or bodegas, we call them, that just sell cheap, you know, chips and really unhealthy food. And that image haunted me, and I think was a turning point, because I wondered, what are these protests, what's the effect we're going to have on these kids?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that at the beach, because I swim. I'm an ocean swimmer, and it was that first pandemic summer, so I was at the beach a lot when I could get to it. And I started taking notice of how at the beach all the children were free and powerful, despite what their opportunity may or may not be, right? And there was this one family, it turns out they were from Ghana, but I didn't know that. The father was from Ghana, the kids were born here. But to watch him interact with his kids as they were jumping off a lifeguard chair, because it was after hours, there was so much love between him and his children that I made a beeline for them. And I just approached him and said, hey, do you mind if I take some photos of your children jumping off the chair? They're so amazing. And he said, yes, of course. And when I emailed him the images, he wrote me back, this is a direct quote, "Thank you for giving my children the living proof that they really are the superpowers that they imagine themselves to be."
And there's the new project.
There's the project.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful?
It was amazing.
So that is what you're involved in at the moment?
Yeah, so I first was just doing the photography. I submitted that series to the Leica Women's Photo Project Award. I received that award, and that gave me, I think most importantly, the confidence, because I haven't been shooting all that long.
Yeah.
But also some resources to evolve the project further. And I decided I didn't just want to make pictures of these kids. I wanted it to be a collaboration with them.
And this is where the poetry comes.
So I leaned into
Here
my
we go, full
poetry
circle.
background.
Yeah.
And gave free workshops to them. And I did one-on-one Zoom sessions with each child in the project. So we really together created this piece of creative writing, poetic creative writing, to go with their portrait. So we had a big exhibit this summer in a public park next to the Brooklyn Museum. Each child had a 6-foot panel. So it was their image, their portrait,
the poetry,
and their writing, and in their own handwriting. So it was wonderful. We had an opening ceremony. All the children came with their families and read poetry. ABC News covered it, so it was a really big deal for them and for me. But for them, they were really in the spotlight, and these were kids that didn't think of themselves as a poet. So when you see the ABC News piece and their attribution, well, not only that, but they list the child's name and underneath they say poet. You know, and this is on the news.
Right.
Now they consider themselves poets, and to hear some of them talk to the camera about, I was thinking about this and I was doing this, and it's amazing. It's really amazing.
So it's just completely come back full circle, right through the whole story, and of course that story now is going to continue for you into Tanzania, into Zanzibar,
I'm
and
going
then
to
hopefully,
Zanzibar.
not even hopefully, it's going to go to the whole world, right?
It's my hope to do this project, the portrait, and then working with the children on written expression, because we need to know who our kids are. Like, this is a complicated world they're inheriting. And we need to give them so much confidence and opportunity. And I think this is a very simple project. You know, it's very simple. I think that's what makes it powerful and doable and duplicable. So to take it to different communities and cultures all over the world for all children. I mean, I started with a specific demographic, but I realized that this is for all children. This is for all children. And I had a connection in Tanzania with a teacher there, a wonderful teacher there, who connected me to the school. So that's actually why I'm going there. But then I have a small grant to do it in New Jersey with some young immigrants.
Oh, very nice.
And those students are from Egypt and Dominican Republic. So that's going to be really interesting, that pairing as well. And I hope to continue, so we'll see.
Sounds like you'll be coming back to exposure with a new exhibition in the next year or two.
I would love to show what we've accomplished and those images and poems here. I think for the kids around the world to see themselves
on a stage like this.
Oh my gosh. I mean, because that's the other part of it, is not only the creating of it, when they see themselves life-size and their handwriting life-size, their reactions, that was everything to me.
It would be kind of interesting to go back and backfill after some certain number of years to each child and see that empowerment of what has it done in their life.
Absolutely.
When you can make your connection back to poetry, to what you do, it'd be lovely to see that.
I would love to do that.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really awesome. We get to find not all about you, but lots about you, right?
A lot, yeah.
We really enjoyed it, so thank you much,
you.
And we look forward to seeing you back at Exposure soon.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing.